CSIS has led efforts within the think tank community to shed light on this crisis and to help understand the parameters and the root causes of the crisis. Moises Rendon, who is our Associate Director and Associate Fellow in the Americas program, has led these efforts on Venezuela. He's done a tireless and exceptional job in addressing multiple facets of this crisis through public presentations like this, private roundtables, written analysis, and through his own extensive travels in the region. Never before in our hemisphere have we had to deal with the kind of criminal narco state that has taken root in Venezuela. This is a narco state that involves both Venezuelan and international organized crime groups with the support, participation, and facilitation of the governments and private firms from countries like Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China, among others. This complex criminal network is sustaining the illegitimate regime of Nicolás Maduro. It has allowed Maduro to survive conditions that would have brought down any normal regime under similar conditions. Maduro does not need the support of his own people as long as he has the kind of international criminal network operating in the shadows and increasingly out in the open in Venezuela. There's been a lot of discussion and focus on this criminal network, but detailed information has come out in bits and pieces. A small fraction of what is actually taking place has been uncovered and described in detail. Doug Farah is very well known for his remarkable ability to put together the pieces of very difficult puzzles. He does this by doing the kind of on-the-ground research and investigations and interviews that are not standard operating procedure here in Washington. His work is truly impressive and very valuable. Before Doug shares his latest work on the Bolivarian Joint Criminal Enterprise, I want to turn the floor over to Moises, who will introduce Doug and then the other members of our panel. Moises?
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Moises Rendon. I want to extend also a welcome to those joining us online. We have many people I know are watching online as well, so thank you for joining. The video is going to be available after the event finished, so feel free to share the video and disseminate it. Today, as Michael mentioned, we're going to discuss a very important and timely topic. This is a new research that illustrates the criminal networks in Venezuela, including the global money laundering empire that the Maduro regime built, the amount of money they move, the geographic and criminal diversity of the network are in context to help explain why U.S. sanctions, despite U.S. stiff sanctions, why the Maduro regime hasn't fallen, right? This is a very important question that I think all the experts are going to touch base on, and among other implications. So thank you, Doug Farah. Doug is the president of IBI Consultants and a senior visiting fellow at the National Defense University Center for Complex Operations. He's a national security consultant and analyst. Doug is an expert on issues of national security, transnational crime, terrorism, terror finance, and non-state armed actors. With contacts across the continent, IBI Consulting works in a wide range of clients from U.S. government entities to private foundations to provide analysis, information, and scenario development, and access to a broad range of on-the-ground experts. So thank you, Doug, for doing this incredible work. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael and Moises and CSIS for hosting this event. I really appreciate it, and I think we're really privileged to have a really good group of panelists as well. Karen Hollis was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats and helped launch me on what has become a multi-year adventure. Selena is one of the leading experts on threat finance in the region, and Jose Cardenas has been on the Venezuela illicit finance structure for many years. So it's a privilege to share the podium with them, and thank you to CSIS. Also, my co-author, Caitlin Yates, is here, and the group that did a lot of the open source analysis and the link analysis that made drawing our conclusions possible. C4ADS has also a delegation here, and we couldn't have done the report without them, so I want to thank them as we get started here. One of the things that we wanted to do, and this began, I think, with DASD Hollis when she was DASD in 2014, was looking at the criminal structures that we began to see emerging in Central America. And as we began looking at these, we began finding that they were all tied to Venezuela in ways that we had not anticipated. We were anticipating the FARC. We knew some of the FARC connections. We knew some of the other connections. And as we began to dig in, we began to view the region through the optic of something I had written about earlier, a concept that we've developed over the last few years, which we were calling criminalized states, looking at what was different in the hemisphere with the Venezuelan and the Bolivarian Revolution playing a more prominent role. And our conclusion had been, in something we wrote in 2012 for the Army War College, was that there's a fundamental difference between normal corruption that we were seeing in the region, what Colombia had gone through, what Mexico is going through, what Guatemala was going through, and when a state embraces transnational organized crime as an instrument of state policy. And that's what we were seeing in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other places across the region. So through that optic, we began looking at what we were doing. Just want to make clear this is not in any way related to the US government as official policy. What I'm saying, it is a research product and not related to how this works. And this is just so you understand where we get our conclusions from. We just want to share a little bit of our methodology. We do the field research. We have myself, field teams. Caitlin does some of the research, multilingual open source research, which Caitlin runs. And then the open source data mining and link analysis, which C4 provides. And so when we get names, corporate records, things that we want to look more deeply into, they can provide an open source, full scope look at what those groups are and how they relate to each other. And this became more and more important as we were doing this, because you have the same names appearing and the same types of companies appearing over and over again, and then our research products. So the Bolivarian inception of the revolution, and I think that this is, we forget this as we go through this sometimes. The Bolivarian Revolution began in 1998, but it has enormous roots back into the Cold War insurgencies in Central America and the Cuban Revolution. And it becomes institutionalized through ALBA. Hugo Chavez has a lot of money. The FARC is immediately embraced by him as an element to bring armed revolution across the hemisphere, something that he cared about greatly. And he spends a lot of money. Evo Morales is elected in Bolivia. Daniel Ortega returns in El Salvador. You have the FMLN win in Nicaragua. The FMLN wins in El Salvador. Desi Bouterse returns in Suriname. You have this constellation of groups that are very ideologically in tune with him and who also want to engage in the same criminal enterprise that he engages in. And then as their oil money runs out, Maduro takes over. They have to engage more and more in criminal activity to keep their enterprise going. And so the picture that we have there is just one of the few pictures, including Jose Luis Merino from El Salvador, are all present, and they're all part of the ALBA network there. And I think it's really important to look at the ties that bind these groups and why they're all together. You see in the bottom left, bottom on that side, Jose Luis Merino with Elias Hawa, who's the main Venezuelan contact of the Bolivarian Revolution, the PDVSA money that flows to Central America. And Elias Hawa flies back and forth. He's sanctioned, but he's not high on the radar. Jose Luis Merino, who's the main recipient in El Salvador of the ALBA funds, and the current Minister of Foreign Relations of El Salvador, who was a guerrilla commander under Jose Luis Merino during the war. On this side, you have Delcy Rodriguez, Diosdado Tarek, and Delcy's brother, who is one of the main heads of intelligence, also very linked to the Central American structures. And here you have Raul Maduro and Daniel. And so over time, it became clear that each of these groups was running their own networks, and that you have a network of networks that was making much of what we are seeing possible on moving the funds. And one of the things we wanted to identify, and in the report, there's a lot of detail, but one of the key things we wanted to identify was the methodologies that are used that we could say with confidence are the primary ways in the networks that we were looking at that the money was moved through. And so we were surprised. We took 5 years of research and sort of tried to go through everything we had learned from beginning to end and put it together in one sort of package, because as any of you know who do a lot of research, you can easily forget half of what you know as you go along, and we had forgotten more than half of what we knew, so we wanted to go back, remember what we had, document it, and then put it all together in a way that we thought would be telling, and it was. We did not I did not anticipate when we started the project of compiling our information that we're going to have 26 countries, but we do. We had 183 people, 205 businesses linked in some way to the different structures. This doesn't mean they're all criminals. It just means that they all touch these criminal networks in different ways. And as we mapped it out, as you can see there, it goes in multiple directions. This little country down here is Uruguay, where they have an enormous amount of financial activity. Russia became very important. Hong Kong is very important. Central America is very important. The United States is very important. Panama particularly. So you have the scope of the operations was much broader than we had thought. And this was important to us because we have, I think, this idea that Venezuela is sort of an isolated problem. You solve the Venezuela problem, you get rid of Maduro, everything will go back to being normal. And what we argue is essentially, no, it's a transnational, multinational criminal enterprise where multiple states engage with transnational organized crime as instruments of state policy. And unless you attack the entire architecture, they will simply be able to morph as they have over time, going from one thing to another. I mean, one of the fascinating things you see is that as the screws have been tightened on Venezuela through our sanctions, Turkey emerges as one of their main allies now in moving out gold and other things. You see Suriname. You see all of these little countries and allies pop up because we view it as a balloon that you simply have to squeeze and the air will go out of it. And instead, things will just pop up elsewhere as you go along. So as we were looking at the typologies, we'll just go through these fairly quickly. There's a lot more in the report, the details of it, but essentially, and this is why we keep stressing the idea of criminalized states. This works because the state allows it to work and engages in it with the criminal organizations. It's not a few corrupt individuals that can be put out of office and then you go back to normal. This is the state from the highest levels as policy engaging. So you have PDVSA, as they did with Alba Petróleos in El Salvador, send $200 million a year in cash with essentially no oil. That money was then laundered through gas stations and things that were supposed to belong to the Alba Petróleos structure. They created dozens of companies, most of which had no economic activity, but because the state could say that they had given money to that organization, $30 million for solar panels. There's no solar panel factory. $20 million for bottled water. No bottled water is ever created, or no factory ever created, but because the state has declared that and controls the Attorney General's office and any investigative body, that money is then, simply by declaring that those projects exist, those, oops, sorry, I don't know what I did there. Does anybody know how to? Yeah. Someone a little more agile than me can.
Moises said yes, and then he pointed to the back of the room. So let's see if he screws up here.
Well, we can also.
No, it's not working.
No. Sorry, Sarah. It's, anyway, we'll keep going. So essentially, by declaring those projects in existence, then you have laundered that amount of money. So because they were using PDVSA, which moved billions of dollars a year in legitimate commerce, it was very easy in the early days to layer in a few $100 million that weren't legitimate. And then as PDVSA collapsed, real oil sales collapsed, oil prices dropped, production dropped, they became more and more reliant, thank you, on the actual criminal activities. So let me go back here. No. And then this is the more typical one, the fixed asset. This is where you just simply take your money out as if you were purchasing oil drilling equipment in Spain. You keep the money there and you buy yachts and nice houses, right? You've justified the money as coming for something that is not destined for. This is where you have the new case of Victor Monescoro, and you have a bunch of Venezuelan, let's say the oligarchs now under pressure in Spain and Portugal and elsewhere because they've been caught with yachts and mansions that they can't justify the existence of. So this is, I would say, the more typical way that money is moved. This is what we look for when we look for money laundering, as opposed to the other more sophisticated ones which are much more difficult to track. Illegal mining is one of the huge issues now. Obviously, gold is one of the key elements in the Maduro survival strategy. If you look at where it's mined on the Colombia-Venezuela border, that's all FARC dissident country. That's where Iván Márquez, who just declared that he was sorry the FARC had gone into the peace process, operates. That's where John Quarenta and all the dissident structures of the FARC are doing gold, coltan, a whole series of different minerals. Gold is beautiful because once you move it out of its place of mining, you can't trace its origin. So you see these really interesting phenomenons like the neighboring country of Suriname on the northern tip there, now exporting far more gold than it produces. The same with Nicaragua. What does that indicate? It indicates that somebody is moving their gold and exporting it as from a different country of origin than the actual country of origin. And you see things like Turkey suddenly being able to buy or transporting out 73 tons of Venezuelan gold and returning the cash to the Venezuelan government as cash after it's been refined in Turkey. Why does this work so well? And this was one of the sort of things over time that, as I learned about gold, that was shocking. If it's less than 95% pure, you can bring it across the border without declaring it a financial asset. So you can walk through the Miami airport with gold that is 95% refined and say, I have a ton of gold. They'll say, thank you very much, off you go. You can then in 2 minutes refine that to 99% pure, which is a financial instrument, at any of the refineries in Miami or Europe or UAE or Suriname, and then you have cash instead of just a commodity. So it's beautiful because it can't be traced, there's always a market for it, and it moves across borders in virtually untraceable ways. And I think that this, if you look at the dissident FARC factions now operating in Venezuela, the Colombia-Venezuela border, what do you see? They're much more interested now in gold than coca. Why? Because coca at the lower levels of the price chain is not nearly as valuable to them as gold is, and your risk is zero. So if you're a criminal enterprise and you're looking for ways to minimize your risk, why do cocaine when you can be caught and go to jail, when you can do gold, and at most you'll be fined if you're caught? That's sort of the beauty of the illegal mining. Environmental devastation is huge. I've been to the mining fields in Suriname and elsewhere, and any of you who have been, the deforestation is horrible, the mercury runoff is horrible. All of those terrible things happen, but they're usually out of sight of the international community, and there's no real coalition to stop that yet. This is the one I think that we pay least attention to and is probably the most important. This is the falsified infrastructure projects. So you have projects, as you have in Nicaragua. 2008, Daniel Ortega and Hugo Chavez together declared that they're going to build a refinery called the Supremo Sueño de Bolívar. On paper, they announced it's going to cost $4.6 billion to build this refinery, which will refine heavy Venezuelan crude into marketable petroleum products. So every year, for a few years now they've stopped, the Nicaraguan government would declare how much they had invested in the Supremo Sueño de Bolívar, $400 million, $300 million. Every time I go to Nicaragua, I go and it's an empty field. There's nothing being built on the Sueño Supremo de Bolívar except a few rusty tanks and a sagging wooden fence and one sleeping guardsman who's always asleep at the gate because nobody comes and goes. There's nothing going on there. Why does this work? Because the state declares that that money has been spent in a certain way, and then you can move the money from there to fictitious purchases for things that go to that non-existent refinery, and then your money goes back home, and you're pretty much home free. It works again because states are participating directly in how this works. Supremo Sueño de Bolívar is a really nice example, but there are literally hundreds of them across the region where the state has declared massive infrastructure projects that never happen at all, and yet the money is spent on them. So it's one of the true advantages of a state is this kind of being able to move money through this type of process. Bank-to-bank transfers, what you see is the ability of even sanctioned banks to open accounts in non-sanctioned banks and move your money across the globe very quickly, layer them into accounts, for example, in Hong Kong, as we've seen in some of these cases. You can collect your money in Hong Kong through a series of shell companies, bring it back home by the millions of dollars, and you're pretty much home free. This works especially well, as we were seeing with Banco Corporativo, now sanctioned in Nicaragua, because it was a state bank. It was Daniel Ortega's private bank, owned in conjunction with his private oil company that he was running, Albanisa. And so you had the synergy of money flowing in, the ability to move it out in different ways through a state-controlled bank, which meant your risk factor, again, was pretty much zero. Then if you look at and you guys have all been focusing on this, the humanitarian consequences of what's happening in Venezuela. As this money flows out, our estimate is that just the two PDVSA subsidiaries in Central America laundered at least $10 billion successfully. Other estimates by other investigative groups of the total of what PDVSA has laundered go from $28 billion to $40 billion. That's a lot of money. So one of the things we do in the report that Caitlin helped put together was looking at what that money could actually have been used for. Forget U.S. sanctions and what the sanctions are bringing to these guys. They have stolen so much money that they could feed their country for multiple years simply by cutting their corruption in half or by a third. It's the amounts that could go out there are simply staggering. And of course, you have the refugee crisis that's not only affecting Colombia, but the entire region. You have Ecuador, you have Guyana, you have the Caribbean islands all being deeply, deeply impacted by this. And as this goes on, the cost of reconstructing or coming back into the rehabilitating the economy and mitigating this damage goes into the multi-billions of dollars as well. So just to finish up here, we dubbed this, as we were looking at this, the Joint Bolivarian Criminal Enterprise. It's based around the Bolivarian states. It's state-run, and it is a multifaceted, we believe, criminal enterprise that operates, unlike we generally think, on a global scale, not on a local and regional scale. It's multinational, it's ideologically cohesive, and it accepts transnational organized crime, as I said earlier, as an instrument of state policy, which fundamentally changes the dynamic of how things operate. Our basic argument is that some of the sanctions and things we're doing now are creative, good, and new. I had argued personally for sanctioning PDVSA as an entity for a long time because of the criminal activity in which it was involved. But until you look at the transnational criminal enterprise as an enterprise and attack it on multiple fronts simultaneously, it will simply adapt and morph into new and different ways. I think it's indisputable that the Bolivarians are considerably weakened, and it's not to say sanctions have had no effect at all. I think they've had a lot of effect, but we're still not getting to the heart of their financial ability to survive. And if we don't do that, they will survive at a minimal level, we argue, for an indefinite period of time. The end is not in sight as long as they can move the money that they've already stolen back in as financial lifelines and continue to receive the funding that they're getting from illicit enterprises. It's enough to maintain them at a minimal level where they can buy the loyalties of the military, keep enough food on the table for them and their families, and keep the small elite that they need to repress their people and stay in power for a long period of time. And I will leave that there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Doug. That was great. That was very helpful for everybody who's following Venezuela these days. The report is going to be available in two places. One, in our CSIS website. You can find the report in English on our event website. This event website is going to be a link there so you can find it. But it's also available at IBI Consultants website, which is Doug's consulting firm. And the report is going to be available both in English and Spanish. I learned today that the Spanish version is out today, so that's important to clarify for everybody in Venezuela and outside of Venezuela who can look at these findings and this research. Great. So now we're going to have a great panel discussion. We have three fantastic panelists with us to discuss these issues. And first, we're going to turn to Karen Hollis. Karen is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. She served as a Principal Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense and the Secretary of Defense on all the special operations and low-intensity conflict activities, including global counterterrorism, direct action, counter-narcotics, and global threats, embassy security, peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and counter-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Additionally, Mrs. Holly has served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for counter-narcotic global threats. Thank you. It's great to have you, Ms. Hollis, and great. Thank you for being here. What's your view of what you just saw from Doug's presentation?
Thank you, Moises. It's a pleasure to be here. I was thinking as Doug was talking about when we started this project about 5 years ago, and I asked Doug, I wanted to know what the Guatemalans in Guatemala felt about their situation, what was their major concern. And he started unraveling. First, was it security, or what was really bothering them. But corruption kept coming up, the fact that institutions were weak and that we were not making any progress. And I think that this research, while we're focusing on Venezuela today, I think a lot of what's going on in Central America, the migrant flows from Central America to Mexico and to the United States are also a byproduct of the massive corruption that is undermining all the institutions from Venezuela up through Central America, Panama, Nicaragua especially, El Salvador. And I've been pitching people for years about corruption. We need to do something about corruption. And I always get the response, well, what can we do about it? And it is a problem. It's a serious problem. But back to this report, I think that it illustrates the impact of massive fraud, money laundering, and dare I say, collusion among government officials, military officers, and the private sector. And it's brought Venezuela to its knees. The shortages of foods, medicine, and fuel, along with the power outages, have given rise to widespread crime and the failure of public services. Government-sponsored repression, los colectivos, the armed gangs, that are contributing to deep, deep citizen insecurity. And this hopelessness has led to this migrant outflows, which none of us have seen in Latin America ever. I guess some of the reporting is saying that it's greater than the Syrian refugee flows, which is just staggering to me. It is clear that Venezuela's economic collapse is the most severe in the past 45 years globally. But it's not the result of war, but is due to poor governance, corruption, and systematic looting of this once prosperous state. PDVSA, the mainstay of the Venezuelan economy, has been ravaged with far-reaching consequences, beginning with Hugo Chavez when he beheaded the organization, put in his cronies, and failed to invest in maintenance and infrastructure. PDVSA is now a shadow of what it was. As this report reveals, false oil sales laundered through front companies and phony oil importers has enriched countless government officials, facilitators, and their cohorts. At the same time, corruption and impunity has reached unbelievable heights, undermined institution and the rule of law. The blatant scoffing of international norms and laws allows the U.S. financial system to be exploited at multiple levels. Money has moved around the globe, found its way back into U.S. luxury real estate and goods and services. I returned just this last week, on Monday actually, from Miami, where the level of investment and growth is incredible to me. I lived in Doral 10 years ago. It is unrecognizable, the amount of investment, and it's primarily Venezuelan money. Whether it's legitimate or illegitimate, I'm not the one to judge that. But I know that our Justice Department is looking at conspiracies and money laundering and looking at all these structures in order to understand better what's going on, and I commend them for that. Gold mining, this is something I've talked to Doug about a lot, because what it has done to the environment, what it has done to the international gold market is incredible. The environmental disasters, but it's also funding groups like FARC, ELN, and it's contributed to widespread human and sex trafficking. And if you read the reports about what's going on in Peru, it is staggering the number of women and children that are being exploited on the margins of the gold, the illegal mining. It just contributes to the lawlessness and corruption, and it's something that really we should keep our eyes on because it's a very important matter. You know, Venezuela's disaster has been fueled by pervasive corruption. The impact of this corruption will be felt for years to come. Long-term debt, the collapse of infrastructure and institutions will hinder economic growth, whether the Maduro regime endures or not. Tougher U.S. sanctions are being felt, however, it will take time to force change. Corruption and leadership in the private sector will exert pressure for the status quo to persist. In the near term, the Venezuelan people will continue to suffer, and it will reverberate throughout the hemisphere.
Thank you, Mrs. Hollis. I just want to leave a question open to the table for later, but you mentioned that, I mean, there are a lot of assets, right, that still under U.S. jurisdiction. As we learned from this report, there are billions and billions of dollars being money laundered and being used through the U.S. financial system. So this is something that should be a priority right now for the U.S. administration, for anyone who wants to follow these networks and trying to increase pressure on the Maduro regime and trying to help the Guaido's administration get off the ground, right? So that's something that we want to discuss later on. But first, we're going to hear from Celina Realullo. Celina is a professor at the National Defense University, where she focuses on U.S. national security, illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, and threat finance issues in the Americas. As a former U.S. diplomat, international banker with Goldman Sachs, U.S. counterterrorism official, and professor of international security affairs at the National Defense, Georgetown, George Washington, and Joint Special Operations Universities. Great background. Thank you, Celina, for being here, and thank you for listening to your thoughts on Doug's report.
Thank you to Moises, and more importantly for CSIS, for really focusing on this major issue that is not just affecting Venezuela, but our entire region. As you know, many who've known, I've made a career of following the money of particularly the bad guys and girls, by the way, that are very involved in this. And first, I want to commend Doug and Caitlin on a really timely, well-researched piece. And I've been following the sanctions part of the Venezuela strategy for a while now, and wanted to also probably shed some light as to this critique that the sanctions aren't actually working. They take a while, and what I think is the most important piece of Doug's work is the fact that we need to think well beyond what we call the transparent, overt economy that the sanctions are attacking. So just by way of background, so the way the sanctions are organized in the U.S., we actually have terror-related sanctions. People probably forget that they're actually designations of Venezuelans who were found to be in support of financially supporting Hezbollah as early as 10 years ago. And more importantly, the lack of cooperation from the Venezuelan regime on broader international counterterrorism efforts. So that's one category. The second one, which I know Doug and Karen and I have been following for a long time, what we didn't talk about today is the massive amount of money that the Venezuelan regime makes from drug trafficking. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly disturbing as the record number of cocaine production, not just in terms of volume, but high quality coming out of Colombia in this kind of post-conflict environment in Colombia is actually also still lining the pockets of Venezuela's governing elite, and more importantly has a lot of implications for those who are in the military and intelligence apparatus who directly benefit from aiding and abetting this global narcotics trafficking. I've just come from a seminar in Northern Africa where we actually convened South Americans as well as Sub-Saharan Africans and those in the Maghreb and Europeans taking a look at this globalization of narcotics trafficking. And what they're trying to see is this very high quality level of cocaine coming through. And it's usually by ship through West Africa and then northbound to very lucrative European markets. So it really is all about the money. And what are the criminals looking at is how to maximize their profits. This is nothing new. Whether we talk about Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, or now the PCC in neighboring to Venezuela is Brazil, there's this really interesting evolution of all the different transnational criminal organizations who they themselves are trying to analyze what the instability or the lack of clarity in Venezuela of people who were their partners and complicit in aiding and abetting this global trafficking, whether it's of gold or of illegal oil sales, or more importantly, cocaine, how that's going to affect them. The other thing that we've seen is a number of designations of specific individuals related to this narcotics trafficking. The more recent one, and it has a lot to do with the political and more importantly the humanitarian plight in Venezuela, are the humanitarian related or the lack of democracy sanctions, which have also been an important piece of the strategy. The two more important sections of sanctions that have been imposed the last several months are the ones against the gold sector and against PDVSA, and then more importantly the petroleum sector. These take a long time. As a former banker and I study economics, there are all these cascading effects. But I do know, and Moises, we've been working with and speaking with those who are working with Guaido's team to understand what asset recovery is going to look like. So as you know, Venezuela had always been a very interesting place to invest until perhaps the last 10 years. But more importantly, there are a lot of vested interests as to how you look at asset recovery. So it's not just what we call the named or the public entities, as well as cases in which that money was pilfered. And I think Karen's underscoring the fact that corruption is literally at the heart of all this activity, whether it's in Venezuela or other parts of the world. But it's really important that we take a look at how Doug and Caitlin's study can inform how these tentacles are much broader than Venezuela and how it implicates other governments in the region and actually well beyond, to figure out who we're aiding and abetting this, basically the illicit economy that's keeping Maduro's regime in power. And with that, I'll leave it for time for questions.
Great, thank you, yes. Remind me, Doug, how many countries are we talking, like the Maduro regime has presence with criminal networks?
26 that we found.
26, okay, 26. So yes, obviously this is a global scale operation, and it's very important to understand, as you said, this is not an isolated issue in Venezuela, this is very global. Jose, great, thank you for being here. As most of you know Jose as well, Jose has nearly 3 decades of experience in the Washington political process and inter-American relations. He has served in senior positions in the U.S. Department of State, the National Security Council, and the USA, where he served as acting assistant minister for Latin America and the Caribbean. He oversaw nearly $1 billion in U.S. development assistance in the region. So thank you, Jose, for bringing your expertise.
Thank you, Moises, and of course, thank you to CSIS and Mike Matera for the invitation to be here. To Doug, congratulations on another groundbreaking contribution to the public debate on not only our region, the Western Hemisphere, but obviously, as we all saw, a broader threat to U.S. interests globally. And it's wonderful to be here again with my old friends, Selena and Karen. I wanted to make 3 points very quickly so we can get to questions and answers. And fortunately, they follow upon a lot of what has been said just now. The first point I want to make, less about policy, but has implications, direct implications for policy, is what struck me is the sheer callousness, the unconscionable lack of concern among the perpetrators of these crimes in Venezuela for the welfare of the Cuban people, the Venezuelan people. That's another disaster we'll talk about another time. The welfare, I mean, Doug had a slide indicating, we all know, the absolute collapse, meltdown of a society, the breakdown of government services, the implosion of the economy, malnutrition returning, diseases that had been eradicated returning, chaotic migrant flows. All of this as the result of a cohort of individuals that are part of the problem in Venezuela simply stealing, embezzling, otherwise involved in criminal activity for their own personal benefit. If you saw the article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about, or 2 days ago, I can't recall now, about the food program, the CLAP program, that the U.S. is about to levy indictments and other sanctions regarding the corruption in Venezuela, is that some of these people, quoting from the journal, some of these people amassed large sums in overseas accounts, as well as U.S. real estate, yachts, and airplanes. And that's putting it mildly. So these are the people who are part of the problem in Venezuela, and this is a point I will return to. Just, again, the sheer unconscionable lack of compassion or any concern for their fellow Venezuelans. The second point about U.S. policy, which Selena was referring to, is capacity. The report quotes Admiral Jim Stavridis, the former head of Southcom, as saying, you need a network to combat a network. My question is, do we have that capacity in the U.S. government? All relevant agencies and departments coordinating together to fight this problem. As we know, in the 21st century, we are facing, as a country, more and more of what we call asymmetric threats. Our adversaries know that they cannot confront the United States on conventional terms. So we are more and more facing, again, what we call asymmetric threats, which are reflected in everything that Doug was talking about. I'm concerned, I'm no longer on the inside, but I'm concerned that the U.S. national security establishment has not reformed with the times. More resources are needed. More people are needed to combat these types of criminal networks. These are very complicated, complex systems built to be concealed. So my question is a rhetorical one, a theoretical one. Do we have that capacity? The third point I wanted to make, and this draws back to my first point, is what are the implications of this criminality, this vast criminality, for Venezuela's transition? I draw you all back to the April 30th events, where we read that several Venezuelan officials, several Maduro officials were involved in a conspiracy to replace Maduro. But we also know at the same time that those individuals, including a few of them named, are not Boy Scouts. They are involved in a lot of this criminal activity. So the question for the Venezuelan transition is that knowing that there are a lot of bad actors who are right now attempting, through their vast wealth, to buy soft landings for themselves. And a lot of that money is being spread around. And so what challenges does that pose for U.S. policy? And more importantly, what challenges does that pose for the Venezuelan opposition? Because when we get to that point, on the question of the mafia state, is that tearing that out root and branch is going to be, it's going to make the removal of Nicolás Maduro look like child's play. So that is the challenge confronting Venezuela, again, as we move forward, and with very, very difficult questions, I believe, for U.S. policymakers and, of course, for our friends in Venezuela that have been working so hard, against astronomical odds to recapture a better future for their country. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. That was very, very helpful, very insightful. Thank you for your comments. Great. So let's get a couple of questions on the table right now. I have 2 or 3 before we open it up for the audience. I promise you we're going to get there in just a few minutes. But one of the questions that I highlighted in the beginning is sanctions, right? And the whole U.S. policy, not the whole, but a very important piece of U.S. policy on Venezuela is a sanction regime, right? How can we increase pressure on the Maduro regime? So knowing now that we have a lot of criminal activities, Doug, and the experts, going on in Venezuela, we're talking about $10 to $43 billion in laundered assets. And despite sanctions on individuals, in structures, in companies in Venezuela, Maduro continues to serve as de facto leader, right? And I quote your report here and says, so yes, we argue that Maduro is still in power despite the sanctions, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm sorry. We argue that this is because of multi-state nature of the enterprise operations, which provide state protection, redundant capabilities, and access to levers of state power throughout the region. Then you go and talk about the amount of money that is money laundering, again, $10 to $43 billion. And then you say this: actions like designating PDVSA and senior Venezuelan leaders are critical. However, the network's ability to adapt and diversify its criminal portfolio means that illicit funds continue to flow. So, give us your take, Doug. Why sanctions has not worked in terms of removing Maduro from office, in given your expertise and your research?
Well, thank you, Moises, and thank you for all the panel for their insightful comments. I think that one of the things, and I think this is touched on in different pieces by everyone here, I think we have not analyzed the network in terms of its international structures. And I think that we, in our work and with C4, we know that there's a lot of money in Spain and Portugal that we're not really in conversation with Spain and Portugal about. We know that the Caribbean, we know that Uruguay, we know some of their key nodes where they have moved their funds, and partly because of resource issues and other things, we haven't engaged in that level of discussion with those countries and those banking structures to do it. And I think the other thing that Selena also mentioned, it is a time-consuming process, and we are still a nation of laws, and so you have to go through certain steps to be able to sanction. I think we could, in some cases, move much more rapidly. But I think that we also don't. If you look at the institutions that are involved in this, they're all very small. You have FinCEN, you have OFAC, you have different pieces here and there that are charged with doing a massive job with relatively few resources and people to do it. So I think that's one of the things. But I think conceptually, we're just starting to get our heads around the size of what we're actually looking at. And I think that has been one of the drawbacks, is that we have not really understood what we're looking at, so we haven't attacked it in a way that it is more coherent and simultaneous.
Right. Any other panelists who wants to comment on the sanction question? Selena, and then Jose, and then Karen, if you want. Yeah.
So just in terms of how the U.S. government has traditionally used sanctions, we talk about carrot and stick. So you've actually seen it very actively used as a stick. But actually, in the case of Venezuela, for one of the defectors, we've used it as a carrot. And we're trying to highlight the fact that removing sanctions against him is perhaps a way to draw those to actually come to the other side. So it's an important piece, but also it's only one part of a holistic strategy. And then the other thing which Doug highlighted is sanctions by the U.S. apply to U.S. banks. And they're very well applied within the United States. I don't go to one banking conference that's not have a whole headline feature now on Venezuela. But the bigger question is, who are the other countries who are our partner allies who actually support the Guaido government, and to what extent are they applying sanctions and shutting down and blocking the assets of Maduro and his henchmen? And that's the bigger question. It's like that balloon effect. They're trying to find other jurisdictions that might be more lax in terms of the application. And it's a very long process to actually find the evidentiary packets to create a sanction, and then more importantly, publicize the sanction. And then in the United States, there are very dire penalties for banks that do not comply. So this is a bigger thing than just the United States, but it also is a real call for international cooperation to exercises economic and financial pressure on the Maduro regime in all the groups and in the Lima group, but more beyond the countries who actually have recognized Guaido as a legitimate government of Venezuela.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, let me go back to a point that Selena made earlier about the drug trafficking. I think that as the death throes of PDVSA continues, and the absolute collapse of any oil revenue for the regime, there is going to be more and more reliance on the revenues, the illicit revenues the regime gains through drug trafficking. And as an outside observer of U.S. policy process, I am not seeing indications that our counter-narcotics policies, whether it's the DEA or DOD, is elevating its activity to impede, interdict the drug trafficking that we know for a fact is going on. We see it through our various capabilities, meaning the U.S. government. So whether it is small planes or small boats or other methods, we need, in my estimation, I'd like to see more indications that the United States is stepping up the counter-narcotics activity to cut off. And that involves the law enforcement in the sense of the DOJ to see more indictments dropped on Venezuelan officials involved in narcotics trafficking. I think that holding those back, we know they're there, holding those back is a mistake. I think that they should be imposed immediately in order to increase pressure on the regime attempting to exacerbate cracks. Thank you.
I'd just like to add that I think one of the things that Jose had mentioned earlier about the capacity, the resources and the capacity of the interagency to implement these in the will and implement these policies, there just is not that capacity. And it's going to require moving assets, moving resources, moving people into better locations so that they can work as teams to do this.
Why that hasn't happened? Like, why do we still waiting for the capacity to be built? No, just, I mean, this is an important question, right? I mean,
Bureaucratic inertia.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I think it's clear. Great. I have another question just for, Doug, but any other expert can also jump in. Doug, you say that PDVSA is the central structure for money laundering. PDVSA, for all of those who, is the oil state-owned company in Venezuela, right? But as we've seen over the last few months, PDVSA's collapsed, right? The oil production is collapsing. I just read in a report that the oil production went down to 800 million barrels a day. At some point, PDVSA was producing 3.5 million barrels. What does this mean? Is PDVSA being not used as much for the money laundering, or is it still a very important instrument for these criminal activities? Tell us a little bit more on the PDVSA question. Yes.
Well, I think it's clear that PDVSA at its height was moving about 100 and something billion a year in legal oil sales. So it's very easy to layer in multiple millions or billions of dollars through those existing structures because they're moving their money around the world. As this collapse is now producing, I think, $12 billion a year in revenue for the Venezuelan state. So that's, 90, 85% fall off in revenues. But the structures are still useful because you can still move money. The way they set it up, for example, in Central America, they had Albaniza in Nicaragua, Alba Petroleos in El Salvador. So they could move the money as PDVSA. Those were subsidiaries of PDVSA. PDVSA owns 51% of Albaniza, 60% of Alba Petroleos. So they could move their money internally as PDVSA funds through those oil companies and then offshore to where they wanted to get it to safe harbor. So I think the structure is still useful. The actual amount of money moving through there is obviously far less, and because they're sanctioned, their ability to move is also limited. The other thing to remember is that they have pre-sold an enormous amount of their oil to China and Russia. So what they are actually drilling, they're only getting about half of that they can actually sell on the international market, which means their actual revenues are much smaller. But I think that's why I think the Turkish involvement in their gold markets is so important, because that's a whole new revenue stream for them. Russian banks and Chinese banks are incredibly important. We finally sanctioned 3 Russian banks that were operating in Venezuela. When you can move your money through Evrofinance Bank in Venezuela and collect your cocaine money, your oil money, and then move it to safe harbor in Russia, completely bypassing the U.S. system, our sanctions can't do anything about that. And so I think it's important. The structures exist and allow a lot of flexibility in how things move, but they clearly are not producing the revenue that they produced.
Anyone wants to add anything before we open it up? Great. Awesome. Okay, let's go to the audience. We have Herbert Torres on the back. Please just say your name, your affiliation, and then we're gonna go straight to the questions. Yes.
Herbert Torres, CSIS. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and comments by the panel. I just have two questions. The first one, in your presentation, I didn't hear much about Cuba. Where are the Cubans there? Do you find they're involved as a state or as individuals somewhere? And my second question is, based on your research, how difficult you think will be for a new administration that is eager, in need to do some asset recovery to, get back, recover part of the money that has been stolen? How difficult you think it will be to recover based on your research? Sometimes we have the impression that those people have been so confident that nobody's going to catch them, that they've been so long in power that they have probably, I think, left some traces there that can be followed.
On Cuba, I think that Cuba is obviously important and they provide the intelligence structures. Our research did not find money flows to Cuba, not because we didn't look for them, simply they didn't appear. So where they are in terms of their intelligence help and that stuff, I think it's fairly well documented. We did not find companies or routing anything going through Cuba in the sections of the network that we were looking at. So that's, it's like I say, not because we weren't looking for it, it's just we didn't find it. On the new administration asset recovery, I think that they have left, I think if we can find some of the trails that people with a lot more capacities and authorities can certainly find them. And so I think that it's not rocket science on some of it. I think that you can do a fair amount of asset recovery without, I think there are a lot of indicators where the money is and how they got there and who the players are. Because as a trust-based organization, if you look at how they were structured, the groups internally are all either family-based, like Diosdado, or all come out of the military academy and then put their families in. You had the Central American structures; they were all fought together in Central America, and then they were all allies of the FARC in Colombia during that conflict and ongoing. So the number of actors doesn't change that much because they're people that they trust, they know, and they've brought into the structure. So you're not looking at an easily expandable web, because now that they're paranoid, they can't easily expand beyond the existing folks that they already know. So I think that we know the main players, or a lot of the main players, and so I don't think it'd be that difficult. But I think you have to look at what we were able to do in part with C4, how the structures overlap. Okay, so who is on all the boards of all these companies? Why are they all registered? Who are the law firms that register them all? Then where else do they have subsidiaries that have the same name and with the same people, and then track it down? And it's hard, and it's a long process, and we're not all young and smart like the C4 ADS people are, who can do these things sort of without thinking about it. I have to struggle with it. So it's, but it's doable, and I think, and you could make a lot of progress relatively quickly.
Just follow up on that question. If you haven't seen Cuban activity on this research, what other countries, what are the major countries that you have seen been involved in this? You mentioned 26 countries. What are the top 4 or 5?
I think one of the limitation we've had is not viewing Nicaragua as intimately tied to the Venezuelan structures, and the FMLN and El Salvador are directly tied to the structures in documentable ways of moving massive amounts of money. I think that Bolivia plays a significant role, Evo Morales' government. I think that Russia plays a very important role. China, particularly the Hong Kong banking structure, is significant. And where we found a lot of money flowing is Spain and Portugal. In ways that are not that hard to trace, but which have not yet been brought to the attention, or they're not on the radar of those two countries. We see a lot of Spanish and Portuguese nationals handling a lot of their assets in the United States and around the region. So I think Switzerland is still a main place, and I think you can't ignore the fact that a lot of their money is still in the United States, and a lot of their assets are still in the United States. So I think that those are those I'd say are the main ones we would
Thank you.
sort out there.
Yeah.
Mike J.G., George Mason University. This is a profoundly important research that you've done, not only for Venezuela, but for what Karen Hollis calls cities of state, vertically integrated criminal syndicates. So my question really has to do with Jose Cardenas' question about our concern about our capacity. One of the leitmotifs in your typology was that there are shell companies almost always involved. The U.S. makes itself totally vulnerable to that creation of anonymous corporations because we don't collect what's called beneficial ownership information. There's a bill moving through Congress right now called the Corporate Transparency Act. I'd just like to get your observations on how important, whether that's important, how important it is, and how that might assist in the type of research that you did.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think without a doubt the corporate structures in Delaware, Nevada, and elsewhere that allow across the Caribbean and many other places that allow beneficial ownership structures where whoever is holding the bond, the shares of that company at that moment is the owner of that company. You don't actually know who the money is from behind for those who may not be that familiar with how that works. I think it's profoundly important. And I think it's a major vulnerability, not only in our country but across the globe for how people move. I think the current congressional efforts, I think, very important. They actually, in talking to people on the Hill, there seems to be some optimism that they might actually be able to move this forward. And I think that would make knowing who actually owns the company and who put the money into that company, I think would be enormously beneficial to law enforcement, to Treasury, to investigators, and not only here, I'd say globally.
If I could just add just a broader theoretical point is that, the irony is that our adversaries exploiting the very lifeblood, the international banking system, the international capital flows that have resulted in the prosperity of the West. Adversaries exploiting the very same mechanisms to do us harm. And it's a huge, huge problem in that we have to balance privacy concerns with rooting out these criminal networks. And that also impedes our ability to counter and, again, to respond and root out the criminal element in what is overwhelmingly licit and productive activity that redounds to all of our benefits.
Yeah, important point. We have a question here, and I believe one over there. So let's just one, and then here, and then Alejandro, and then, yes, sure. We're going to have time, so good.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Matt Spitalnik. I'm with Reuters News Service. Several of you have stated that...
Is the microphone on?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So Matt Spitalnik with Reuters. Several of you have stated that it's going to take time, that all these measures are not day and night types of events, and yet this administration has, as well as the opposition in Venezuela, have kind of started out casting this as something that they would be able to get the military to flip and Maduro's loyalists to flip very quickly. So to what extent, if at all, is it a mistake for them to have raised these kind of expectations? And should they be tamping that down now and talking the way that you're talking, that this is a long-term process of sorts?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Anyone?
Well, I'll jump in.
Sure.
I think it was, I have followed very closely, Matt, the public statements of the administration from day one. And I think by and large, they've been careful, I think, and I think a lot of other commentators and actors have raised expectations that this was going to be wrapped up and tied up in a nice little bow by the evening news. I think that for most of us observing the situation and speaking with my friends in the administration, we're were aware that this was not going to be a quick and easy antiseptic solution, that I've always described it as, frankly, it's a war of attrition. And the bad news is that the ones who are going to pay the biggest price are the Venezuelan people. But there is no other way to attempt to help influence a positive change in Venezuela without targeting the regime for these pressure tactics. I think that if I was a messenger, if I was devising messages for the administration, I would probably do more to put out there that this is going to be a hard process. Things are probably going to get worse before they get better. I believe that. But at the end, I do not believe that Nicolás Maduro survives. I do not believe that he has the wherewithal, even with the Cuban presence there stealing his spine, to, at the end of the day, overcome the pressures that are only going to increase on the ground in Venezuela. And I think that if add some constructive criticism to the administration, is that that they ought to be clear that this is going to be a tough slog.
I would just add that a lot of this stuff is very creative. Like, I don't think anyone, and I've been doing this for a long time, I certainly did not anticipate that when you designate Banco Corporativo in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega would convert that into the National Bank of Nicaragua and hide all the assets there. I mean, that's a pretty creative thing that you can do at this stage. So I don't think you can anticipate every move. Who expected Erdogan from Turkey to show up in Nicaragua and Venezuela and declare Venezuela a strategic ally and start flying his gold out? Not something that I would have anticipated going ahead. Now that we see the creativity and their ability to morph into these different things, I mean, Suriname set up a gold refinery that doesn't exist at all and is exporting gold as if it did, and where does that gold come from? Why is Nicaragua and Suriname, why are they exporting more gold than they produce internally? But there's a whole gamut of things out there that they immediately seize on and move on. They're not that easy to anticipate, and so I don't think it's stupid. I think we view things as very traditionally. This is how money is usually laundered. This is how states normally behave, which is why when you have states that embrace transnational organized crime as a policy, you have these different iterations that are not expected because we're not used to dealing with states that are criminalized.
If I may just add on this, I think it's a critical question. I mean, once we have the right diagnosis of the problem, which I think this report sheds light on that, right? Like, this is a state that is involved in criminal activities, money laundering in masses, in billions, narco trafficking, then we can maybe think about the solution. I don't think, unfortunately, the international community is there yet. I think it's important to understand the problem first before going to the solutions, and that's why this conversation is critical and timely. But yes, so let's go back to that. But first, let's hear from you on the first row, and then we have two gentlemen on the middle.
Moises, that was absolutely fabulous. I go to these meetings once a week for the last couple of years. I put down my mojito, though I've been involved in Latin America since John F. Kennedy was president. But the important thing of today is this is international, not us Latin American fans. So you've got to face the Europeans on this. Spain and Portugal are allies, our friends. Smile, but kick their asses. Turkey, we focus on that creep that is going to steal the election in Istanbul next week. Go after him. He's our NATO ally. He fought with us in Korea. Go after him and repeat it and repeat it. And instead of just having one session like this and then go back to our mojitos, go get it. This is an international thing. The nasty man I worked for years, Elliot Abrams, knows how to play international crap. get those guys to go after it. And when I was in graduate school in the 50s, I taught 6th grade. Repeat it, and repeat it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the comment. Okay. We have 2 questions. Let's get both of them together, if you don't mind.
Yes, Iran, how important is it?
Just, sorry, your name
yes,
and
Frank Fletcher with Daniel Morgan Graduate School.
Great.
Here in D.C. How important is the Venezuelan banking sector now for Iran? Does Iran have strategic capabilities in Venezuela, such as missiles? And what is the support for Hezbollah today? And how important is the Venezuelan support to them?
Thank you for the question. Alejandro.
Yes, my name is Alejandro Rizante. I am a member of the new board of the PDVSA ad hoc. Something that for me is missing on the discussion is the role of the exchange rate system in Venezuela. Okay, the fact that you can move millions of dollars in a day at 2 different exchange rates, I believe that is one of the principal tools that PDVSA and the government has in order to build this empire of corruption with different things. No? The fact that you can buy or sell dollars, okay, in the domestic market at 2 very high with a very strong different exchange rate, of course, can create profits or high profit, okay, for everybody, because at the end was not just, and I need to say that, was not just the government and PDVSA that used exchange rate differential to high profit or to create profit if they need it, was also the private sector, the multinationals, and a lot of different bad practice on the accounting part that until now was missed on the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for the point. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, I think on the last one, the exchange rates are incredibly important, yes. Then the ability to manipulate the exchange rate and keep, and bring in dollars and then get certain amount of bolivares, et cetera. I think that and their ability to exchange on the debt market and all those things are hugely important. They're very difficult to go into in great detail here, but I agree that is not solely a government issue, but certainly the private sector and multinationals also certainly took full advantage of that. And I think that is one of the ways you see them moving their money, particularly into the Caribbean and elsewhere, is through these enormous exchange rates. They'll exchange $800 million in debt for $30 million in cash and wash it through companies, particularly in the Caribbean, that we've looked at. Iran, I think, since their ill-fated or I wouldn't say ill-fated, relatively unsuccessful efforts to bank through Ecuador, I have not seen them return noticeably to the banking sector of the Bolivarian states. So we didn't find that. It could be that it's there, we didn't find that. I think there's a clear link to some members of the Venezuelan regime, on the Tarek side and the Nasser side, and all to Hezbollah. I think that, like most groups, what my assessment is that most groups like stability, and Venezuela is no longer stable. So I think you see the migration of a lot of what we were looking at as the Iranian influence to Bolivia and elsewhere that are much more stable. I think the fact that Nicaragua blew up unexpectedly a little more than a year ago also caught them off guard, and so now they're reaccommodating the external actors to the new realities on the ground because they didn't expect that. But one of the things I think that I was at a conference that Karen sent me to a couple of years ago with General Breedlove at NATO in Germany, and he said something that I thought really captured sort of the essence of what we're looking at. He was talking about Russia, but I think it applies to the Bolivarian states. He said that our problem with Russia is that we think we're all playing soccer on the same field. So when Russia does something, we do a red card, a yellow card, we try to punish them. He said the problem is they're playing rugby. And what we want to sanction them for is completely irrelevant to what they're doing. And I think that is the essence of the Bolivarian Revolution. They're playing an entirely different game. So we say, okay, we're going to throw you out of the OAS. What do they care? That's like irrelevant to them. We're going to do this, that. They're playing an entirely different game on a different field, and we think we're all going by generally the same rules and that they're breaking the rules so they can be punished for that. And I think that is the fundamental mindset we have to get over in dealing with this criminal structures, we're not actually dealing with states that behave in a way that we think states would normally behave in. They're doing something entirely different. And until we get that clarity, I think we will, and we don't really have diplomatic tools to deal with states like that. We're not equipped as a Westphalian structure to deal with countries that go way out of bounds and start playing a different game. But I think that, which means, partly goes to what you were saying about Iran. I mean, Iran plays that game too, so they may be playing on a different field that we're not seeing at. We may still be primarily looking at the soccer field.
I just want to make one comment about returning to the issue of capacity, is that the point of the spear for many of the counter policies that we're talking about as what the U.S. should be doing or is doing is OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Treasury Department. And I work on some other issues, Cuba being one of them. And oftentimes when I say to my friends in the administration or in the executive branch, and I say, why aren't you, meaning OFAC, doing more to crack down on illegal tourism to Cuba, or something pertaining to Cuba? Their immediate response is, well, okay, what issue do you want us to take people away from to work on Cuba? Iran? North Korea? Well, that kind of ends the argument right there. But what I relate that anecdote is to show again that the national security establishment hasn't changed with the times. And as Karen also said, it's about resources, it's about people, and it is about training them in the new arts of countering asymmetric threats. And in this particular case, transnational crime and corruption involving illicit money flows, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I believe it's the challenge of our times, and maybe Congress can take the lead on this because they're the appropriators. But I really hope that, again, that we can break out of this 20th century national security mindset and get more in tune with the unconventional asymmetric threats that we are encountering in the 21st century.
Thank you. Yeah, let's go on the back.
Norma Gutierrez from the Law Library of Congress. Do you have any comment with respect to the sanctions imposed on Nicaragua, whether they have had any significant impact in their participation in the network?
Thank you for the question. Let's go one more over there. Yes. I see that he's raising his hand.
Yeah, Mike Bossert, Department of State, retired. A question is the ultimate strategic function and purpose of this corrupt network. I mean, classically, corruption serves the purpose of personal enrichment. Here, this is a network that has broader global or network strategic aims. The money goes from PDVSA, transferred to false projects that don't exist in Guatemala or El Salvador. So what happens to the money then? What is its ultimate purpose? Is it ultimately to not just personally enrich people, but prop up these very authoritarian regimes or something else? So what happens to all this money when it flows?
Yeah, that's an important point. And let me push a little bit on that question too, Doug, if you don't mind. If the problem is so regional and globally, I'm going to his point to the importance of the U.S. and other countries like the U.S. trying to work together with its allies, right? With Colombia, Brazil, and on NATO, other countries who have capacity and have already the capacity to help and to work together. So that question too, but up to you.
Well, on Nicaragua and El Salvador, I think we're finally seeing actual results now. I mean, Albanesa is gone. Banco Corporativo has been reformatted into the National and Banco Nacional de Nicaragua. all of Petróleos in El Salvador is now gone. They've been thrown out of all the banking systems. If you go by their gas stations now, they say solo efectivo because they can't take credit cards anymore. And so José Luis Merino has been named now on the corruption list, et cetera. So I think that a lot of steps have been taken in ways that are significant and have put a significant speed bump on the Central American structures because they have a little less liquidity and a little less ability to adapt quickly. They will. And I think that one of the things that you have to keep in mind in all this, and this goes a little bit to the second part, is that aside from personal enrichment, which is, I think, very important, there is a strong ideological component still to this network. And I think the Bolivarians have a very clear idea, which was born with Hugo Chávez's announcement of the Bolivarian Revolution, socialism for the 21st century. They want to recreate Latin America in ways that are profoundly different from what it traditionally had been, profoundly anti-American and profoundly different in an economic structure. That has not gone away. I think that there is a significant part of that in the project that they're working for. So when you see massive amounts, I mean, we didn't talk about this much because it's hard to get into everything, but see a lot of FARC money moving around, okay? The FARC moved out multiple billions of dollars during the peace process to Central American structures. That money is now being returned to Colombia and elsewhere, often through Russian companies, because now the Russians are able to play in the field down there. So you see the continuity of the project. I mean, it's been interesting because when we started looking at this group in 2014, 2015, they were ecstatic because for the first time they wanted two things. They wanted the Russians to come back, the Soviets to come back, because many of them were Soviet trained, and they were ecstatic that they had actual political power. The FMLN was, and José Luis Merino's crowd was thrilled because they never really thought they would take power. So after 27 years, they're in power. And the Russians came back, and the Chinese came back, and they were riding really high. Then Ecuador withdraws, Cristina loses in Argentina, Brazil loses with the PT, and they're suddenly on the defensive again. So there's this ongoing sort of back and forth as to how far the Bolivarians go before they're pushed back, but the structure remains with the clear intent, of which the FARC is an integral part, to remake Latin America in new and different ways. And I think that is ultimately part of the strategic aim of massing the money and keeping it as this, what they view as the revolution. I mean, José Luis Merino used to tell his people all the time, we were not defeated in the Cold War. We are in a historic pause, and we will be back. And in some ways they are.
Yeah. I agree completely with Doug's analysis, and I would only add to that absolutely ideological component within Latin America, but ties of expediency to otherwise wholly disparate regimes elsewhere that seek, again, to combat what they believe is the great Satan, and that is the United States. So you see these alliances of expediency building all around the world where wholly different types of agendas are aligning because the preeminent objective, of course, is to undermine U.S. influence around the world and to leave these authoritarians and others to pursue their own agendas.
Yeah. Karen, if you don't mind, I mean, I have this question about the importance, and you have the background and the experience at the Defense Department, right, of working with different allies to combat counterterrorism and narcotics. So why is it important right now to really work together with other allies and other countries to fight this criminal network?
Well, it's extremely important. And as we've been talking, I hark back to a meeting we had with the Five Eyes in the different parts of the interagency, looking at Ukraine assets and the recovery of those assets. It's extremely complicated, extremely difficult. You've got high-level FBI, Treasury, OFAC, and trying to unravel these issues. And it takes, it's resources, and it's the will. And I understand that this president is very concerned with Venezuela, and I think if the will can be engendered, then perhaps we can make better progress on this. I think it's working with the Brits, working with the Aussies. We have done incredible things. We've done interceptions of drug trafficking off New Zealand, off Fiji, working with the Coast Guard, working with our Navy. There's a lot of activity that can take place. Without the cooperation of allies and friends, we're out there alone. You must have that cooperation. That's why the Lima Group, I think, is really, really important.
Absolutely.
Great. Great. Any last comment, Doug, that you want to make before we close? If not, this has been a rich discussion already. Again, the report is going to be available in our CSIS website in English and Spanish, and at IBI Consultant website. If you want to be, it's a 20-page PDF report. I encourage you to look at it. I think it's very important. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, all the experts, and thank you, everybody, for coming to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.